thank you for joining us on this panel to speak about saving a very special little creature, which is only found in southern Africa, the African penguin. I'm joined today by a wonderful group of people who have dedicated many years of their life to protecting these very, very special birds. My name is Pippa. I am a member of the Sea Change Project, and I directed My Octopus Teacher. And I've been visiting Simonstown in the Boulders Penguin Colony since I was a little kid. So it feels like penguins have been part of my life for a very, very long time. For the last few years, I've been focused on showcasing and exploring the Great African Sea Forest, and these little penguins are a very important resident of Cape Town's kelp forest. So now I would like to introduce you to Cayley Christos, who was the field producer of Penguin Town, the new Netflix series that chronicles the life drama of these penguins. Habs Pillay of WWF South Africa, Craig Smith of WWF South Africa, and Lauren Waller of SANCCOB. To begin with, Cayley, I know you are co-owner of Red Rocks International, which is a fantastic wildlife filmmaking company, and you've been telling stories about nature for more than a decade. What was it about African penguins that captured your imagination?
Hi, Pippin. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here with you all. African penguins are really special. They're very, very charismatic, and I think especially in the film industry, one of the few birds that you can put on screen and people will be attracted to and interested in. So for us, it was an obvious choice to go down there and sort of look at the penguins and start casting them to see if they would work for a series. What we didn't realize and what started to become clear while we were down there and working with stakeholders like SANCCOB and City of Cape Town was the really dire situation they were in. We knew they were endangered. We didn't realize to what extent and how bad things were for them. And so it became not just a fun documentary that we wanted to make, but something very important.
You had quite an unusual approach to telling the stories of the penguins. And I'd like to understand a little bit about why you decided to, rather than go the normal kind of voice of God narration route, why you decided to take us into the minds of a penguin and try to show us the world from their point of view a little bit.
When you're telling stories about animals, there's always a very fine line. Either you can go full on conservation and show people everything that happens. And I like to think about this in the way that we deal with our own lives. So like a news story, if something bad happens, we don't necessarily put the worst pictures up there for people to see. We're a little bit more sensitive about it. And I think going down there to see the penguins, we saw a lot of terrible things happen to them. We saw them get stuck in plastic bags. We saw them get run over by cars. We saw them get eaten by predators. They have a really hard time down there in Simonstown. And we could have either splashed that on the screen for everyone to see, and there are documentaries that do that very effectively. But I think here what we wanted to do was we wanted people to connect with the penguins. We wanted them to feel like they were part of the penguins' lives. And in doing that, I think it would have been insensitive and maybe the wrong direction to go to really splash out all the gory details. What happened when we did that is I think we made the show a little bit more accessible to children and families for co-viewing. And again, the impact of that is huge. You're reaching a wider audience, you're reaching a younger generation, and hopefully we're getting the message about the penguins out to a far wider audience.
And what do you think it is about penguins that makes them special? I mean, I know it's always dangerous to anthropomorphize, but from watching Penguin Town and spending so many hours immersed in the lives of these very amusing but also relatable little birds, there are things about penguins that remind us of ourselves, and I wondered if you could talk to that a little bit.
Well, as you said, anthropomorphizing is not everybody's cup of tea. But as a filmmaker, I think we're very privileged that we get to spend such a large amount of time with our subject matter. And so for penguins, we had a team of 20 plus people on the ground spending every single day 24/7 with these penguins for nearly 9 months. And when you do that, I think it doesn't matter what it is that you're filming, but you're dealing with a living being. And it's hard as a person not to give them a name and not to start caring about them when you see what they're going through on a day-to-day basis. And so we did, we sat down there and we called Mr. B and his children, Petal and Twig, and, we watched them go through their lives. And they walk upright like people, they have families and relationships like people, they go through struggles like people. And how can you not want to look after them and protect them when you're seeing them go through these things every single day? I mean, Petal and Twig, two of the chicks in Penguin Town, had a very close relationship, and they spent a lot of time together, very close to each other, looking out for each other. Whereas there were other siblings, like the Courtyard chicks, for instance, that really disliked each other. And so they would sit on opposite sides of the nest and they wouldn't go anywhere near each other. And, there may be some scientific reason for that I don't know, but watching it from the outside, it certainly looks like personalities to me.
And given the insight you've just given us about what makes penguins so special, I want to speak to Lauren Waller, who has dedicated the last 20 years of her life to protecting and understanding seabirds. And Lauren, I want to understand a sense of what you've seen and how you've seen things change over the last 2 decades in terms of African penguins.
Thanks, Pippa, and thank you for having me. It's very disheartening having worked with the penguins for so long, and every year you go to the area where you do your field work, and the small colony that you're studying just gets that much smaller, and then the following year that much smaller, and then the next year you go back and they're gone. And so this crisis that they're in, which it really is a crisis, is unfolding, right before your own eyes, and it's very difficult to see, and it makes it hard to go back to those colonies, because you think, how much worse is it going to be this year? And they've lost over 95% of their population. So when we say they're having a hard time, it's no exaggeration. They're endangered. And every year they reach the lowest level on record, and they're continuing to decline. And it's very difficult to deal with. And as Cayley says, it's impossible to spend time in a colony observing these birds without developing such a deep appreciation for them. This little 3.5 kg bird that goes out to sea and somehow is able to navigate its way back. It will swim out, 10, 15 kilometers, and is able to come back to that little island or colony that it can't see. And there's just so many things that you experience when you observe and spend time in these colonies. And it's incredibly difficult to see this unfolding.
It really is heartbreaking. And from the research that I've done, protecting penguins was the very, very first conservation law that was kind of written into our law during the time of Jan van Riebeck. So I think these were the first animals that were chosen as a conservation species in South Africa. So it really says something very, very sad that we're about to lose them. And I wonder if you could give us some sense of where we've gone wrong and how this has happened.
So historically, we allowed egg collecting and guano scraping. So this happened many, many years ago. It no longer continues, but it's had a huge impact on the numbers of birds that are present now. It's also had a negative impact on the quality of their habitat. So you would have seen on Penguin Town the various nesting habitats that the birds use. Normally, they'd be on coastal islands, they'd be making their nests in these guano burrows. But that guano's been removed up to 6 meters high in some of these colonies. And so that lovely soft substrate that they would make their nests in has gone. They face predators, they have to deal with some oiling incidences. But really the biggest thing at the moment that's driving these continuous population declines is a lack of suitable food and or sufficient food. So they feed on sardine and anchovy as their primary food source. And the sardine stock is in an extremely concerning level. And there's a wealth of evidence that shows, they breed better when the fish stocks are better. If the food availability around their breeding colonies is good, they breed better. Adult survival, chick survival, juvenile survival, all of the critical parameters that contribute to penguin growth and population recovery, all of those are reliant on food. There's also been environmentally driven a change in these food stocks, so it puts them out of the foraging range of some of the birds. And of course, when the food stocks are low, competition with commercial fisheries has that much more of an impact.
And if we look at the very charismatic colony that Cayley and her team documented with Penguin Town, those penguins live on Boulders Beach in False Bay, and they seem to be having a better, more successful time than other penguins. That colony has been referred to as a kind of hope spot for penguins. And can you give us some insight on why that they're doing better?
So if you look at the overall population, you just see this nosedive in population numbers. But there's this kind of little line of Simonstown that stays fairly even. So their population numbers aren't showing the same trend as the overall species decline. And they're exposed to the same predation threats, the same kind of issues with breeding habitat, the disturbance in terms of people and vehicles and things like that. But they just don't follow that same population trend. And if you look at sea, where they feed, they're in a fairly protected area in False Bay. There's no fishing there. And so the level of at-sea threats and pressure on the birds in terms of reducing that food availability is somewhat mitigated. And so it does give us an idea or a sense that we can do a lot better by the penguins if we look at the population and the trend around Simonstown.
And next I want to go to Craig Smith, who's a senior manager for the marine portfolio at WWF. Craig, to follow on from what Lauren's been saying about the threats that penguins are faced by, can you give us a sense of, for me, penguins are not just cute little animals that look like they're wearing tuxedos waddling around Simonstown. They're symbolic. They're symbolic of conservation in South Africa, and they're also one of the most charismatic marine creatures on our shores. And what will it mean if we lose these birds?
Hi, Pippa. And I certainly would agree with you that they're certainly one of the most charismatic birds that I've encountered. I'd even go as far as to they've got a very quirky nature to them as well, and as many people experience them as they waddle about on land. But if you ever have an opportunity to take a dive with a penguin, they're anything but quirky or anything strange, because they are extremely agile. They are so fast, they literally fly underwater. And that's the penguins that I come to become accustomed with and love. And it's important that they are so versatile and just so speedy underwater. And that is because they are top predators, and many people don't regard penguins as top predators. They see them as this cute and cuddly birds, and that's probably as far as it goes. But as Lauren mentioned, they feed on anchovy, they specialize on sardine and anchovy. And if we look at their abundance and we look at the abundance of sardine in the southern Benguela, we see there's a very tight correlation in terms of the two populations. With the decline of sardine in the southern Benguela, we've had a similar decline with the penguin. And that shouldn't be strange, because they are specialized feeders on anchovy and on sardine. And sardine has got to a point where it is almost collapsed in the southern Benguela. And there's huge concern, worrying concern regarding the status of sardine in the southern Benguela. It was just 2 years ago when the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment declared a zero TAC, which is a total allowable catch for sardine. It's the first ever in the history of that fishery. So the sardine fishery is not just important for the penguins, it's extremely important for us as human beings as well, for jobs, for a cheap source of protein. But the penguin is giving us a warning signal, and it's not just the penguin. We are seeing similar declines in top predators that forage on sardine, that forage on anchovy, such as our gannets, the Cape gannet, also following similar drastic declines in population. We're also seeing fish stock that feed on sardine and anchovy, like our Cape salmon, following similar trends as well. And this is a very important worrying concern in the ecosystem. Something's not right in the southern Benguela. We are seeing declines in various species, and the penguin is telling us that things are not well. And that with this constant decline, there is something that we need to do. There's a lot that has been done in terms of mitigating declines, but this is one issue with regards to the availability of food, which remains the last issue that needs to be resolved. And unfortunately, that issue is an issue which has competition with the small pelagic fishery because they're both competing for the same fish. And we've had experiments around islands where islands have been closed to fishing, a 20-kilometer radius island closure. And that is proven to show that there is a positive result. When fishing is prohibited, we have positive results for the rearing of chicks for those particular penguins. But unfortunately, we haven't got to the stage where enough protection has been afforded to all the colonies where penguins are nesting. Boulders is the exception, and Lauren already mentioned it's a colony within False Bay that has no fishing in terms of small pelagic fishing. So that is one example where there is stability within that colony, but that's not the case for most of the colonies around our coast. But there's also a more pressing issue as well, and that is issues of climate change. Since 2005, we started to see a major shift in where sardine and anchovy are found along our coast in South Africa. Prior to 2005, most of our anchovy and sardine were fished along the west coast of South Africa. Post 2005, we see a shift along the south coast, which makes it's out of the range of a lot of the colonies of penguins on the west coast for foraging purposes. So that's a huge worry because not only are the penguins competing for food on the west coast with the small pelagic fishery, there's also less food to compete with because that food has shifted to the south coast. It's almost like history is repeating itself. We have a neighboring country, Namibia, which has had a much larger fishery for sardine than South Africa has ever had. We're talking about catches up to 1.4 million tons of anchovy caught in a particular year in Namibia. South Africa's, in comparison, our maximum catches of sardine and anchovy combined has been about 500,000 tons on average. So a lot smaller fishery, but yet if you look at Namibia had overfished its stocks, despite very good intentions to manage their stocks sustainably, but that stock has collapsed. So once again, coming back to the story of the penguin, there is almost a huge cry that if we don't take this seriously, we could be facing the same situation that Namibia has faced and is continuing to face. Because despite even the reductions in catches of sardine in Namibia, that fishery is still collapsed and has not recovered. And that is despite 2 decades now of serious interventions being made.
So how do we learn a lesson from what our neighbors in Namibia have experienced, and what can we do now to ensure not just that our penguins survive, but that our very, very important fishery is sustainable as well?
That's such an important question, because the easiest thing to do from a fisheries management perspective is to manage a fishery based on the fish that you're targeting. But remember that all fish is only one component of an ecosystem. It's a lot more complicated than that. So managing fisheries is not just managing a single species. The whole ecosystem needs to be taken into account. And penguins are part of that ecosystem. Human beings, whether we like it or not, we're part of that ecosystem as well. So when management is imposed, it needs to factor in that when you declare a quota for sardine, you need to take into account all the components of that ecosystem that requires sardine as a food source, not just human beings. So this becomes a very important message for government in particular, that when they look at managing the sardine fishery, it needs to be done on a holistic basis, and it needs to be an ecosystem approach to fisheries management, not just a single species approach. And in that way, hopefully, it's a lot more difficult, agreed, there's a lot more money that's required and capacity, but the consequence of not doing so, the results are so dire that it's just unpalatable. What would it be that in today's age, with all our sophisticated technology, with all our science, and we have a charismatic species like the African penguin going extinct on our watch? It's unthinkable. But that's the reality if we don't do something soon.
Thank you, Craig. And I think that an unfortunate trap that we so often fall into in the conservation space is this idea that, it's nature or people. And the challenge now for all of us as conservationists and conservation storytellers is to come up with new solutions and new stories about how nature and people are really one thing. And we need to find a way of coexisting with the weird and wonderful creatures that we share our planet with, that give us so much, in fact. And I want to bring in Pabs Pillay, who's the environmental behavioral change practitioner for WWF South Africa. Pabs, I know you've spent many years of your career trying to figure out how to work with people and convince them to make choices that are good for us as human beings, but good for the natural world as well. And what do you think is the single biggest thing that an ordinary person can do when it comes to saving the African penguin, this very important symbol of a healthy ocean, in fact?
I wanted to tell you, I started my career as a marine biologist, and now I spend most of my time working on people, which is the oddest situation ever. And they are the most difficult creature to change behavior. I think I have better luck with some of our other marine species. When people think about penguins, they automatically think of that far removed fluffy bird that is so charismatic and cute, and they take it away from their everyday lives. And, as Craig and Lauren and Cayley have said, penguins are top predators, and they're so important to keeping a marine ecosystem stable. And it's important for South Africans and everybody to realize that the ocean is actually a pivotal system that our existence depends on. It drives our climate, it exchanges heat, it's where we get about 17% of our protein from, it's where we get our recreation, it's culturally related, it's spiritual to most people. It is one earth system that is so vital to us actually existing on land. So when we remove ourselves out of there, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice. And when we lose a species like a penguin on our watch, we're actually doing more harm. Lauren, in a previous discussion, had said to me, the penguin is the iconic canary in the coal mine. And that analogy is that, they'd put a canary in a coal mine, and if the poor bird died, it meant it wasn't safe for humans to enter the mine. The penguin is our canary. And it's not just for the marine ecosystems, it's for our own existence. And that becomes a pivotal key to start this conversation around, where do humans fit in? Well, we fit right in the middle of that, because it's our decision making and what we do as a species that affects this species, that affects a bigger marine ecosystem. So my first port of call would be, make smart decisions, make well-informed, environmentally sound smart decisions. What a lot of people don't understand is South Africa exports just over 50% of our seafood, and we import 50% of our seafood. So make smart choices when it comes to the seafood you consume. Let it be sustainable. There are lots of sustainable ratings. In South Africa, we have the Southern African Sustainable Seafood Initiative. Overseas, there's Seafood Watch, there's Ocean Wise, there's a whole range of them. These rating systems have a very important role to play, because what we consume, how much of it we consume, and when we consume it, plays a very, very vital role in how an ecosystem continues to be sustainable, and it helps with building resilience. And one of the things we're seeing is that the community and the ecosystem around penguins are losing their resilience. Hence, the penguin is losing its resilience, and we're actually losing a very, very important bird. So, make smart choices, get informed, be resilient in your own choice making. So when I say that, I mean, read a label, question labels, look at the can of seafood, understand what information is being offered to you. And then most importantly, hold your retailer and your policy makers to account. We've heard around fishing industries and quotas. If we know there's a problem and there are solutions, like an ecosystems-based approach to fisheries, there are solutions around what you consume, when you consume it, how you consume it, where you consume it. And for me, and Craig alluded to this, I spent so many years studying marine sciences to be a marine biologist. And it is a legacy I do not want to leave behind, that I was around when the penguin demised. I think it would be the worst legacy I could leave as a marine biologist. And I think most of us, all of us, Lauren, Craig, Cayley, will agree with that I think that's not a legacy I want to be remembered for, having lost the African penguin.
And then perhaps I recently came across a quote, which I really loved, by an excellent conservation scientist called Peter Kariva. And what he said there was, when it comes to our environment, science tells us what to do, but it's storytelling that makes us want to do it. And for you, as a behavioral change officer, what is the power of telling stories and the power of social media in the conservation space today?
Well, I mean, both of those are unbelievably powerful, both storytelling and social media. And usually when people ask me, what can I do? And do I have the power to bring about change? And I say, well, you have power in two forms. You have your wallet, so you don't have to buy something if it's not sustainable. And you have your voice. And every single person wants those two pieces of power. You got to use them effectively. So your voice is unbelievably important in actually carrying out around stories. I mean, you just have to see how children respond to stories. And every one of us still has that child inside us. In the behavior change area, we call it the pester power of children. Children can pester their parents enough that they will change their behavior. And we got to use that. So as conservationists, storytelling becomes vitally important. Social media becomes really important because it's an avenue in which to tell those stories. And I think if we can get, the hashtag Save the African Penguin trending, I think we can help take those stories to government. And just to end, one of the oldest forms of communication we've had as human beings is storytelling. If you look at whether it's a painting on a rock cave or it's a book, it's always been about stories. So stories is the one thing you believe in. And believe me, that's the one thing that will stick with you because it makes you feel something. And when you feel something, you change it.
Thank you so much for joining me today and for everything that you've shared about our little charismatic canaries of the ocean. And for everybody who's watching, as Pav said, you're all part of the story, and African penguins are part of your story. So if you can watch Penguin Town, speak about the plight of penguins, and use the hashtag Save the African Penguin. And one of the things that comes across very powerfully in that show is that penguins are the most incredibly dedicated parents. Penguins do everything that they can to ensure the success of their next generation. And I think all of us in the conservation space, that's a big part of why we're here, whether we have children or not. Every decision that we make now is going to impact on the human beings who live on this planet tomorrow. Penguins are important for all of us, and they are a symbol not just of the environment that we have today, but of the environment and the legacy that we're going to leave for all the human beings that come after us.